the minds that moved the world. And the secrets they hid, we admire them. Quote them. Build civilizations on their ideas. They were philosophers, scientists, writers, geniuses whose thoughts shaped nations, governments, revolutions, and religions. But behind the brilliance were secrets, obsession, cruelty, contradiction, and sometimes hypocrisy. Because the minds that changed the world often struggled to understand themselves. In this episode of Lesson Lost, we uncover the hidden lives of 12 of history's greatest thinkers and reveal the parts they left out of their legacies. The question is no longer what did they teach us, but rather, Brain 1. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychology and the obsession he couldn't control, he revolutionized the way we think about the mind. He gave us the unconscious, dream analysis, and the infamous Oedipus complex. He was the father of psychoanalysis, and his name is still etched into every psychology textbook. But Sigmund Freud had secrets. And they weren't just theoretical. For nearly 2 decades, Freud was a daily user of cocaine. He first used it to treat migraines and depression, then recommended it for everything from anxiety to morphine addiction. He even praised it in published medical journals, calling it a magic drug. But behind the scenes, his experiments had disturbing consequences. Several of his patients became addicted. One had a psychotic breakdown. Another nearly died. Freud ignored the fallout. He defended the drug even as its dangers became clear. But that wasn't his only obsession. He believed every action, no matter how innocent, was driven by sexual desire. His theories fixated on infantile sexuality, repressed urges, and taboo fantasies. Even his relationship with his own daughter, Anna, has been the subject of deep ethical debate, as she became both his protégée and his patient. To Freud, everything was symbolic. Everything was hidden. And sometimes, the darkest truths were his own. Milky Way, 2. Isaac Newton, the genius who talked to angels and wanted the world to end, he gave us gravity. Invented calculus. Laid the foundation for modern physics. But Isaac Newton wasn't just a scientist, he was an alchemist, a mystic, and a man obsessed with the apocalypse. Hidden in his private journals, discovered long after his death, were thousands of pages not on science, but on biblical prophecy, secret codes, and angelic communication. Newton believed the Bible held encrypted messages from God. He spent decades trying to decode the Book of Revelation, predicting the end of the world would come in 2060. He also believed in alchemy, the mystical art of turning base metals into gold. Not as metaphor, but as literal transformation. He wrote feverishly about divine fire, elixirs, and philosophical stones. To the world, he was a rational thinker. To himself, he was a chosen vessel for divine knowledge. He rejected the Trinity, defied church doctrine, and refused to publish most of his spiritual work for fear of persecution. The man who brought order to the universe believed that true understanding came not from reason but from revelation. Isaac Newton changed science forever. But secretly, he wanted to change reality itself. Baby, 3. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the philosopher who abandoned his own children, he inspired revolutions. Declared that man is born free, but everywhere is in chains. His writings shaped democracy, education, and individual freedom. But Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the man who spoke so passionately about the rights of children, abandoned every single one of his own. Rousseau fathered 5 children with a woman named Thérèse Levasseur. Instead of raising them, he dropped them off at orphanages, anonymously. In 18th century France, this was often a death sentence. Most orphans died young, malnourished, or were forced into hard labor. Rousseau never visited them, never sought them out, and never expressed guilt. Until much later in life, when he blamed the circumstances of the world for his choices. Yet at the same time, he wrote passionately about child-rearing, publishing Émile, one of history's most influential books on education. He taught the world how to raise free-thinking children, while refusing to raise his own. It wasn't hypocrisy, he claimed, just the burden of genius. But to many, Rousseau remains a man who preached love of humanity while turning his back on those who needed it most. Hammer 4. Karl Marx, the revolutionary who couldn't manage his own house, he wrote the manifesto that inspired revolutions. He dreamed of a world where the workers would overthrow the capitalists. He was the father of communism and the Marxist ideology. But Karl Marx had a personal life, full of contradictions, and the man who advocated for equality and shared wealth could barely afford to feed his own family. For most of his life, Marx lived in poverty, struggling to make ends meet, often relying on financial support from his wealthy friend, Friedrich Engels. Ironically, Engels was the son of a factory owner. Marx's family was constantly in debt, and they lived in squalor, often in overcrowded, dilapidated apartments. At the same time, he preached about the plight of the working class, about how bourgeois oppression kept people in chains. Yet, Marx's own children were often sick and underfed, with 2 of them dying before reaching adulthood. The revolutionary who called for the abolition of private property had trouble keeping the roof over his own family's head. He criticized the exploitation of workers, but didn't seem to have the resources, or the ability to care for his own. Marx's life was one of unrealized ideals, a man who could see the world's flaws, but never quite fixed his own. Artist palette 5. Leonardo da Vinci, the master who hid his secrets, he was the definition of a Renaissance man. An artist, engineer, anatomist, architect, inventor, and dreamer. He gave us the Mona Lisa, the Vitruvian Man, and notebooks filled with machines centuries ahead of their time. But Leonardo da Vinci was also a man of deep secrets, and he worked hard to keep them hidden. His journals, over 7,000 pages, were written in mirror script, a form of reverse handwriting that could only be read in a mirror. Some say it was to protect his ideas from theft. Others believe he was hiding something far more controversial. Among his notes were anatomical dissections, detailed drawings of flying machines, and designs for military weapons, including tanks and machine guns. Though he claimed to be a pacifist, he actively marketed his war machines to rulers and dukes across Europe. Da Vinci also had no known romantic relationships, though records show he was arrested for sodomy in his youth, a crime punishable by death at the time. He was released, but the episode shaped his silence for years. His sexuality remains debated. His personal life, obscured. And even his religious beliefs, unclear and likely heretical. A man who saw the human body as a machine, and built machines inspired by birds, storms, and death itself. Da Vinci showed the world how to look deeper. But when it came to himself, he left us guessing. Speaking Silette, 6. Voltaire, the voice of reason who profited from slavery, he was the voice of the Enlightenment. A champion of free speech, reason, and civil liberties. His sharp wit and bold criticisms of religion and monarchy made him a hero to revolutionaries. But Voltaire, the man who once said, in the mid-18th century, Voltaire held shares in companies that trafficked enslaved Africans to the Americas. He defended his investments, arguing that slavery was necessary for commerce. Even worse, his personal correspondence contains statements that reflected the racial prejudices of his time, claiming some races were inferior by nature. This from the man who wrote Candide, a scathing critique of injustice and cruelty. Voltaire's public philosophy was about tolerance, but his private choices helped fund one of the greatest atrocities in history. He fought for justice with his pen, while profiting from oppression with his purse. The contradiction isn't just personal, it's historical. Because even the brightest minds of the Enlightenment cast shadows that still darken our world today. Brain, 7. Albert Einstein, the genius who couldn't solve his own relationships, he changed physics forever. Gave us E equals mc squared, redefined time, space, and gravity. He became the face of genius, a symbol of human potential. But Albert Einstein struggled deeply with the one thing he couldn't measure: human connection. His first marriage, to fellow physicist Mileva Maric, began with passion and intellectual equality. But as Einstein's fame grew, their relationship crumbled. In one infamous letter, he laid out a list of conditions for Mileva to stay with him: serve him 3 meals a day, expect no affection, leave the room when told, stop speaking unless spoken to. Their relationship ended bitterly. And although they had 2 sons, Einstein reportedly showed little interest in the one who suffered from schizophrenia, never visiting him in the asylum where he spent most of his life. He later married his cousin, Elsa, and had multiple affairs, often bragging about them in letters. In some of those letters, he described women as biologically inferior. Einstein was a pacifist, a humanitarian, a voice against racism and war. But in private, he often failed the people closest to him. The man who could calculate the curvature of the cosmos struggled to understand the orbit of the heart. Angry Face, 8. Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher who despised women, he was one of the most influential thinkers of the 19th century. His philosophy shaped Nietzsche, Freud, Wagner, and even Einstein. He spoke of the will to live, the illusion of happiness, and the suffering woven into existence. But Arthur Schopenhauer didn't just despair over the world, he directed a special kind of hatred toward one group in particular: women. In his infamous essay, On Women, he wrote that they were childish, short-sighted, and incapable of reason. He claimed their role was to obey, serve, and bear children, nothing more. He never married. He viewed love as a biological trap, and once stated that to marry means to do everything possible to become mutually disgusted. But his misogyny didn't stop at words. In one documented incident, Schopenhauer was taken to court for physically assaulting a woman who annoyed him by talking loudly in a hallway. He shoved her down the stairs. The court ruled against him. He was forced to pay her a pension, which continued for the rest of her life. When she died decades later, he noted it in his journal with a single Latin phrase: he taught the world to question everything, but never once questioned his own bitterness. DNA, 9. Francis Galton, the thinker who invented eugenics, he was a cousin of Charles Darwin. Mathematician, statistician, explorer, and pioneer of modern data analysis. He gave us concepts like correlation, regression, and even the weather map. But Francis Galton also gave the world something far more dangerous: eugenics. In the late 19th century, Galton became obsessed with human heredity. He believed intelligence, morality, and even ambition were inherited traits and that society should be designed to breed better humans. He coined the term eugenics, and proposed that governments should encourage the reproduction of the fit, while discouraging, or even forcibly stopping, the reproduction of the unfit. Galton's ideas were influential in Britain and America. They led to forced sterilization programs, marriage restrictions, and were later used to justify Nazi ideology. He believed he was serving science, improving mankind. But in doing so, he created the framework for one of history's greatest moral atrocities. Today, eugenics is a dirty word. But Galton's fingerprints remain in policies, institutions, and academic foundations around the world. The man who sought to perfect humanity forgot the value of imperfection. Landmark 10. Plato, the philosopher of truth who inspired totalitarianism, is one of the most revered thinkers in history. The student of Socrates, teacher of Aristotle, and the author of dialogues that defined Western philosophy. Plato gave us the idea of perfect forms, the pursuit of truth, and the blueprint for the ideal society. But hidden within that blueprint is a vision that some have called terrifying. In his famous work The Republic, Plato describes a society ruled by philosopher kings, where the state controls every aspect of life, from who marries whom, to what children are taught, to who is allowed to live. He proposed censorship, state-run propaganda, and even selective breeding to produce superior citizens. In his ideal city, individual freedom was a threat. Truth came from above, not from the people. Centuries later, totalitarian regimes would find inspiration in Plato's ideas, from Stalin's centralized education system, to Mussolini's praise of hierarchy and control. To be clear, Plato wasn't a dictator. But his model of perfection was built on control, not liberty. He sought a society of order and wisdom, but one where the individual existed for the state. A lover of truth whose truths were sometimes too dangerous to live by. Jigsaw 11. Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher who lost himself, he declared that God is dead. That morality is a construct. That man must rise to become the Übermensch, the superhuman beyond good and evil. Friedrich Nietzsche challenged the foundation of Western thought. His ideas shattered old beliefs and inspired generations of thinkers, artists, and revolutionaries. But Nietzsche's own life was one of loneliness, illness, and eventual madness. He suffered from chronic migraines, vision loss, and mysterious physical ailments. He never married. His romantic advances were often rejected, most famously by Lou Andreas Salome, who inspired his deepest writings and deepest pain. By his mid-40s, Nietzsche's mental state began to collapse. In 1889, he witnessed a man beating a horse in the street. Nietzsche ran to embrace the animal, sobbing. Shortly after, he collapsed, and never recovered. Spent the last 11 years of his life in near total silence, under the care of his mother, and later, his sister. During this time, his work was twisted by others, especially his sister, Elizabeth, who aligned with nationalist and anti-Semitic ideologies. She edited and published his notes to make him sound like a prophet of fascism. In truth, Nietzsche despised nationalism. But his voice had been silenced and others spoke in his name. The man who told us to become who we are died not knowing who he had become. Milky Way 12. Stephen Hawking, the mind that explored the cosmos while battling the darkness within. He unraveled the mysteries of black holes, explained the origins of the universe, and inspired millions by defying a disease that tried to silence him. Stephen Hawking was called the greatest mind since Einstein, a man who peered into the fabric of time and space while trapped in a failing body. Diagnosed with ALS at age 21, he was told he had only 2 years to live. He lived for over 5 decades, publishing groundbreaking theories, authoring bestsellers, and becoming a global icon of resilience. But Hawking's personal life was more complicated than his public image. His marriage to Jane Hawking, The woman who cared for him, stood by him, and raised their 3 children eventually collapsed under the weight of fame, illness, and emotional distance. Later in life, he began a relationship with one of his nurses, Elaine Mason, a woman whose past included a history of controlling behavior. Rumors of abuse, manipulation, and isolation swirled for years. Though investigations found no conclusive evidence, many in his circle expressed deep concern. Hawking also wrestled with ego. Colleagues described him as brilliant but often domineering, competitive, and harsh. He defied gravity with his theories. But he couldn't escape the gravity of being human. A man who showed us what lies beyond the stars, while struggling with what lay within. Brilliance and brokenness, we remember their ideas, quote their wisdom, build entire societies on their thoughts. But behind the pages, formulas, and philosophies, they were human just like us. Flawed, contradictory, brilliant in one moment, broken in the next. Some sought truth, some chased power, and some tried to escape the very minds that made them famous. So the question is, can we still learn from those who lived in contradiction? Maybe that's where the real lesson is, not in perfection, but in the messy, unfinished stories of the minds we admire. Cheering megaphone, call to action, talk to your audience, speech bubble, which story shocked you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments, we highlight the best ones in our next video. Thumbs up, like this video if it made you see history's icons in a new light. Bell, subscribe to Lesson Lost for more untold truths and uncomfortable questions from the past. Because sometimes, what they thought isn't nearly as fascinating as who they were.